Love you, Mom. I love you, Linda.
I could just hear her phone ringing. And I'm thinking, why is she not answering it? And the dogs were over there just barking. Said, no, like, this is wrong. It's all wrong.
We went out there to check on Linda. We were getting no response.
I started yelling for her.
We were trying to look in the windows. The house was a mess.
It looked like there had been a fight. This is bad.
We learned that her ex-boyfriend had some violent tendencies. He even choked her in the past. I'm thinking, time's ticking. Gotta find Linda. Let's find her alive. We are doing everything we can do to confirm that Linda's there and if her well-being's okay. When we eventually get inside, the radio was still on. And the gas stove was still on and burning. There are some things on the floor that's usually not there. We see the lamp knocked over, and there's a broken necklace on the floor, along with Linda's purse and cell phone.
When I saw the broken necklace, that was like fear. You could tell that it had been ripped off. It was like, no way. Just no way.
Definitely appeared to be some kind of struggle happened in there, fight of some kind or something. We are going through the house, but Linda's not there.
It just makes your worst fears automatically go to bad places because she always had her phone on her and the dogs would always be with her. She didn't go anywhere without them.
The worst case is she has been taken against her will, and what else has happened to her?
She's somebody's mother, she's somebody's daughter, she's somebody's cousin, she's somebody's sister. She's also somebody's friend. She's a lot of people's friend.
I spoke with a lot of friends. When discussing possible suspects, they had mentioned Linda's ex-boyfriend, Charles Wilhype, that Linda had recently broken up with, and Jay Roth, that had been with Linda the night before at Linda's house. We needed to find them as quickly as possible to figure out where Linda was.
Linda Riley was my next door neighbor. And when she first moved in, she had these two little puppies. And I thought, oh gosh, here we go, some crazy dog lady. And she turned out to be a very amazing person. I knew her as Twiggy. She was a very tiny person, but she's got a big, bubbly personality. We'd meet out in the yard every morning and we'd have like a cup of coffee or something together and became friends. I don't think I remember ever seeing her without a smile on her face.
Jay came down consensually. I was kind of taken aback because we made numerous attempts to get in contact with Jay and had been unsuccessful with that. Jay said that he had heard that Linda was missing and he knew that we would want to talk with him. Now I have to figure out if he may have done something to Linda or if he could point us to where Linda might be located.
All right, Jay, again, I appreciate you coming in and talking with me. So you were with her last night.
Yeah.
Tell me about last night. Tell me what you guys did last night.
He called me and wanted to go dumpster diving.
And then you went back to Linda's?
Mm-hmm. We just talked a little bit like that and sat and watched TV.
Okay. And then how late did you stay over there?
I left her a few minutes after 3, I think it was.
Okay.
I texted her, made it home okay, because she was worried about me.
Did she reply back to you when you sent her this text?
No. You'd probably sleep already.
Can I see that?
Mm.
Okay. Do you mind? How do I see the rest of your messages?
Okay. About 10 o'clock.
Okay.
She wanted me to take her to the med shop today to get her inhaler and stuff like that. And she didn't answer, so I went and messed around the house and some cleaning. And then I texted her. I said, "Well, girl, I guess you don't want to go today. I think I'll go fishing for a while." Thanks, kiddo. And that was at 2:46.
Whenever I asked to look at his phone, he readily gave it up, and his version of events matched the text messages. It did not appear that he was holding anything back.
What would you consider your guys' relationship?
I think we're pretty good friends.
Yeah.
Well, we've had a little bit.
You had a little in a relationship, maybe having sex on occasion. Is that what you're talking
Yes.
about? Okay. Have you guys ever had any problems before with each other?
Oh, we've been in little arguments and stuff like that a couple times, but you know.
Nothing
It's
big
just,
though.
It just passes and stuff. I've got to protect her, and keep her out of trouble, and keep her away from that ex of hers.
Who's that?
Charles Wilhite. He was beating her and all kinds of and she come down to my house and talk to me. I helped her get away from him.
He got worked up when talking about Charles, and he's really trying to point the finger, but he genuinely seemed concerned about her, and he was totally cooperative. He really didn't provide anything that would add suspicion to him. So Jay is free to go.
Well, you have my number, so if anything comes up, I appreciate you volunteering to come down here on your own too as well. So let you get out of here, okay?
Okay. Appreciate it.
At that point, I needed to speak with Charles with the hope that he would lead us to where Linda was.
Get up a seat for me there. Thanks, Charles. All right. When was the last time you talked to Linda?
Valentine's Day.
Okay.
I called her on Valentine's Day and wished her happy Valentine's Day. Please don't tell my girlfriend that.
Oh. You guys were together for how long?
For 18 years.
When did you guys separate or break
In
up?
the middle of last year, I was tired of all the arguing and fighting. That's when she started hanging around with Jay. He helped her move out.
Did she mention that she was having problems with anyone?
Jay is the only one I know of. She told me that he'd beat her up and kicked her out of his van. I found out today that she never did press charges on him.
It was readily apparent, both Jay and Charles had animosity between each other, but Jay didn't bring the physical altercation up during the first interview with him. That was very suspicious. So I wanted to see what else Charles had to say, what he could tell me.
So basically what you're telling me is you're saying you think Jay has something to do with this.
I've heard from 2 different people. Jay was the last people that were supposed to have been seen with her. I hope you guys catch him quick.
Well, I appreciate you coming in again and cooperating with us.
My head was kind of spinning, trying to decipher who's being honest, because we had no physical evidence to point us in the right direction.
All right, Charles, if you hear anything or...
At that point, I needed to know if Jay did, in fact, assault Linda.
I told him that Linda had told me that her and Charles did have fights like every other couple, but they had more of a loving, affectionate relationship. And he just was not on my suspect list at all. And then I told him Jay Roth was really the only person that she had had any problems with.
She said that Linda claimed that Jay assaulted her in his vehicle, which matched with what we had heard from Charles Wilhite.
She said he gave her a ride somewhere, and then he tried to choke her and literally tried to pull her tonsils out of her mouth. And he's like biker type size, like big hand. And she's tiny. then I was like, no, this isn't cool. This isn't right, you know?
So the focus really came down to Jay because he's the last person that is seen with her. And now I am aware of the violence between he and Linda.
Time is not on our side. Once you get to the 48-hour period, your chances of finding that individual alive is very slim.
Thanks again for coming in. We greatly appreciate your help.
I had made up my mind that I was going to get a lot more pointed with my questions. Let's cut the chase. No more games. I want to know the truth.
Hello, I love you. Love you, Mom. I love you, Amanda.
Linda has a daughter, and she lives in Japan, but they would talk on the phone all the time. This is how this week went. This is kind of what I did today. And all of a sudden, she's getting phone calls that her mom's missing, you know. And it was hard because I told him I'd watch over her, and I did, but nobody ever expected this.
We believe that Linda was abducted. And I had Jay admitting that he's the last person to have seen Linda alive. I've got to figure out if there was more to his story that he was not telling me.
We've talked to so many people, and there's no trace of her or anything after you leave the house, a little after 3. Where do we go from there?
I don't know. There's all kinds of possibilities. Linda was saying somebody's been trying to break into her house several times. She's sweet and got a tender heart and like that, you know. She's had a lot of problems in her life. And I've tried to help her as much as I can, you know. But she walks all over the place. And the people that she deals with besides are kind of shady too.
Have you guys ever had any physical violence? No hitting, pushing, shoving, nothing at all like that?
No. There was one occasion, I took her over to see this guy she wanted to see, and we could drop her off, but he wasn't home. I said, so I'm going to take you home then. I don't want to go home. I said, well, I'm not going to let you out here. I want out. And she reached over to grab the horn, and my hand, I went up like this, and it went in her mouth. She thought I got her perfect. It was accident completely. That's the only thing that happened between us. But then we talked afterward and it was okay. But she wasn't afraid of me for that. I haven't raised a hand to her or nothing, never pushed her or anything. I wouldn't do that.
Okay.
I felt like he was really trying to downplay the incident, but I didn't confront him because I don't want to do anything that's going to get him to stop talking. I was still holding out hope that Jay would lead us to where Linda was.
Where do you think Linda is right now?
I don't have a clue.
Okay.
Yeah.
You think she could be dead? You think somebody could have killed her?
I hope not. I like the girl. She's sweet, you know. She's got a lot of problems that I've been like that, but I hope not.
Okay. Did you have anything to do with her being gone?
Being gone?
Yeah. With her being missing right now?
No. How would I? No. Huh. I'm worried about it, like I said. I didn't know anything about it.
So you didn't have anything to do with it then?
Why would I do that?
I don't know. You tell me. Because we're just trying to find her.
Yeah. Well, I hope you do. You know, I'm worried about it too.
You think I'm leaving anything out?
I don't think so.
After my interview, I was suspicious of Jay.
All right, Jay, you ready to get out of here?
But I don't have anything that can hold him, so Jay was released in the hopes that he would continue to speak with me if something else came up. Our crime scene processors go through the van, and they showed me a very, very small, dark-colored spot in the back of the van. He believed that it was blood, and he said that when they swabbed it up, it appeared fresh. Immediately, I drove to where her parents lived in Arkansas to obtain DNA samples from them and brought them over to the crime lab. It was a couple days later when they confirmed that it was Linda's blood. At that point, there was no evidence to show that Charles Wilhite had any involvement whatsoever. But every little sign that we had was pointing at Jay. And Jay became my point of focus. I was holding out hope that she was still alive. I contacted Jay to see if he would respond for another interview, to which he agreed.
Oh, all right, Jay. We're grasping at straws here. Have you heard anything at all?
I haven't heard of
Nothing.
Not a damn thing.
You really care for her, don't you?
Yeah. I like her smile and twinkle in her eye, you know. Her country, she got a weird laugh, you know, like that. I miss her, man, you know.
Well, it almost seems like you care so much about her that you...
Yeah, I loved her.
Yeah,
I loved
I can see that. But Jay, there's some stuff that's come up in this investigation, okay? And we need to talk about it. And, you know, there she is right there, you know. Well, Jay, you and I both know you're involved in this. The evidence clearly shows that you're involved. Okay, so we need to know what happened.
What do you mean I'm involved?
Jay, we know that you're involved in Linda's disappearance. We know that. Jay, hear me out. You've got to do the right thing right now. Okay? Jay, you got to tell me where she is.
I have not a clue.
I really changed my interview tactic to where I was pointing the finger right at Jay. And I just moved in as close as I could get, but he stayed calm. He didn't raise his voice. He never got defensive. I felt it was the right time to inform him of the blood being in the vehicle.
Jay, when you brought your van in for us the other day, when you allowed us to search your van and process it for evidence, we found blood in your van.
Yeah. Well.
Whose blood is that, Jay?
Hers, mine, dogs.
Why would it be Linda's blood?
Because she's been in and out and stuff of the van and stuff. She's cut her hand, and I don't know, she cut a finger in there someplace.
When did she cut her finger in there?
She's been in there for a year, in and out and stuff.
Okay. Well, Jay, the blood's fresh. Look at that. 99.9999999% is Linda's. Jay, you need to do the right thing right now. You need to tell us what happened in there, and you need to tell us why it happened.
Nothing happened other than what I have told you. She was in and out of the van. She cut her hand in the van.
Jay, we're long past that. We're long past that. This is fresh. You can't get around it. That's Linda's blood in your van.
The frustration is definitely there because it's one denial after the next. He's not budging. I started to wonder, is he ever going to give it up? And it was scary to think that he may not.
Did you kill Linda?
No.
You did kill Linda, because if Linda was alive, you could take us to her right now.
I did not kill Linda, and I resent the fact that I am being accused of something I did not do.
How else would you explain it, Jay?
How do you know she's dead anyway?
Why wouldn't you think she's dead?
Well, hopefully she isn't. But I have no clue if she is or not. I miss the girl. I'll keep hoping she's going to show up and I'm going to hear something from her.
Jay, we know that's not going to happen.
I felt like I was in a boxing match, and if I got one good blow on him, then he was hitting me back with multiple. I was not able to get him to budge.
Jay, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure things out, because I guarantee you I'm no rocket scientist.
Well, I'm not either.
You know? Either you're the most unlucky guy on the face of the earth, or you're obviously the person that did it. Because guess where every arrow was pointing?
I guess it's all pointed at me.
Of course. Every arrow. How do you think you do on a polygraph test?
I don't know. I don't believe in polygraph tests too much.
Because you're telling. Are you telling me the truth?
No, I'm telling you the truth. Yeah.
Okay. So we do a quick polygraph, you know, and that'd really go well for you. That could help eliminate you. So I'm guessing you'd probably want to do that to help eliminate you from some of this.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let me go and I'll make arrangements. Do you need some more water or anything?
No,
right
I'm
now?
good, thank you.
Okay, all right. I'll be right back.
I was excited because I believed he was going to fail it. Polygraphs cannot be used in court, so we couldn't use that against him. But that would give me something that I could really go at Jay with and attack him with the polygraph failure.
See this chair right there for me, Jay. I'm gonna set this over here because I'm bound to knock it off in my floor if I don't, okay? Been talking to Detective McCamus today and everything in reference to Linda, I guess. Mm-hmm. So I'm ready to start the polygraph exam. It's up to you on whether or not you want to take it. Would you like to take the polygraph exam?
I'm kind of hesitant because anything I say can be misconstrued or something like that, whatever you got.
Well, the only thing you're going to say to me is yes or no. And I'll be honest and straightforward. I'm going to ask you questions specific to Linda's disappearance and whether or not you had any direct involvement in that or have knowledge that you're withholding from Detective McCamus, okay? I can't make a decision for you as to whether or not you want to take the exam.
It'd be something better if I had a lawyer present or something like that, maybe? Or...
That's your choice. I can't make that decision for you. So, are you wanting that?
The police asked me my top 3 suspects that I would think. And I said J, J, and J.
I didn't really like him. He would get jealous of her friends. It didn't matter if you were male, female, or what. But Linda, she just tried to help and made everybody feel comfortable. Anytime there was a mood that felt like the slightest bit heavy, she was gonna make you laugh.
You just need to let me know yes or no, whether or not you want to take the exam.
I don't know, this just seems weird and stuff like that. If I say something wrong, it's
Okay.
going to be taken wrong or something
Okay.
like that.
Do you want to think about it for a few minutes? And then I'll come back in and then you can let me know what you decide, okay? So I'll give you a few minutes to think about it and then I'll be right back and check with you.
Okay, fine.
Yep.
It was obvious that Jay was very, very nervous, but it was definitely a red flag for me to use some caution because I don't want to push him to the point that he decides that he's not going to cooperate further. So I spoke with Detective McCamus.
Jay had made multiple statements to me that he would do, whatever it would take to find Linda and to try to help her out. So I decided I was going to bring that up to see what Jay would have to say about that.
Jay, how you doing?
Okay.
He said you're thinking about not doing this right now?
Yeah, I'm uncomfortable with it, stuff like that.
Jay, you've been
But it only makes
completely
sense.
cooperative throughout this whole ordeal, and you and I, we've gotten along pretty darn well, I think.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to lie to you. If you decide you're not going to do it, alarm bells are going to be going off like crazy because this is your shot to help eliminate yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You've told me the whole time that I just want to help Linda. I want to find Linda. I hope she's okay.
Mm-hmm.
I want to help you guys out. I want to cooperate with you, and this is your opportunity to help verify. You're telling the truth, right?
Mm-hmm.
You say you're telling the truth.
But until we can clear your name, we don't know. There's always that
Still
doubt
on
for
the
us.
list, yeah.
Well, just unfortunately, I mean, that's the way it is.
I don't trust computers, they screw up all the time.
It's not the computer, it's your body. All it does is record your body. It has nothing to do with the computer, doesn't do any thinking. It's just a recording device.
I don't know.
It was absolutely critical to keep Jay on board and talking with me because we still have no idea whatsoever what happened to Linda or where she is.
Jay? I like you, Jay. Shoot, we talk fishing and animals probably all day with each other. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
But right now is the time where you need to help eliminate yourself. There's absolutely zero reason for you not to do it, and that's how it is.
All right.
So let's do it, Jay. I'll get Detective Byrne back in here. It won't be long. Get it over with, and then we'll move on from there.
Finally, when he was out of excuses, fortunately, he agreed to take a polygraph.
Let's get this over with.
Okay, Jay, the questions are about to begin. Are you 65 years old?
Yes.
Are you physically responsible for Linda Riley's disappearance from her residence on February 27, 2012?
No.
Did you physically cause the death of Linda Riley on February 27, 2012?
No.
Did you physically remove Linda Riley from her residence on February 27, 2012?
No.
Okay, that was the final question. We're done at this point, Jay. I just need to go over the charts, okay?
Unfortunately, there was nothing else in the rest of the home that the investigators could find that would help in terms of where do we need to look next for Linda. So it really came down to I am going to have to get a confession from Jay.
Control North 21 bike arrived.
At that point, Detective Byrne informed me that there was no question of the results that Jay did fail it. I knew he was not being truthful in his statements, so let's get some closure for Linda's family.
Well, we got the results back, Jay, and it's kind of what we both knew. He failed it pretty bad. Let's just cut to the chase. Were you defending yourself? Was it an accident or was it intentional?
None of the above.
Jay, we're past it.
We may be past it, but that's the truth. That's what happened.
That's not it, Jay.
It is.
Jay, that's not it. Jay, you need to tell us what happened to get this over with.
He continued with his denials, and it was at that time when I decided I was just going to totally switch tactics. I knew that he lived with his son, Jason, and so I wanted to talk about him just to see if I could get him to budge.
Jay, you got to do the right thing, you know, mainly for yourself, of course, but your boy. Poor old Jason, he's really upset about the situation because he realizes what's going on and he knows what you did. And you don't need to be putting this kind of grief on him as well. Because I think, you know, he probably deserves some answers as well. Sure, he does.
We had been in the interview room with Jay for about 10 hours, and the Jason angle was the first real sign that there was some effect on Jay. He just really seemed moved, and I felt that there was almost this sense of defeat. And so I just wanted to pounce and push it because I felt like finally there's the potential that Jay is getting ready to break.
You just can't leave him hanging like this because there's going to be questions because he wants to know what made my dad do this, because that's not like my dad to do something like this. And this is your chance right here. But I can at least take something to him and go to him and say it was a freak deal because it wasn't supposed to happen, was it? No, it wasn't. It was just a freak occurrence. I know that's what it was. It just was a freak thing, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Well, tell me about it. I know it just. I know that's not you. So tell me how it all went down.
We were talking on the couch and so get along just fine, you know. And we're talking about people coming over. And I don't know, just things happen. We can just didn't mean to do anything at all.
So everything was going okay, and then started talking about all the guys that she had coming over.
Yeah, we got in a little argument about it like that. She got mad, and I guess scuffled a little bit and stuff, and knocked her tea over, banged her head. I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to hurt her. Now it's
What'd she bang her head on?
The edge of the table and the floor.
And how bad was she hurt?
Knocked out.
Knocked out.
I laid her in the van.
Laid her in the van. You had to carry her out. Okay. You carried her out. About what time was that?
Time that I said, a little after 3.
A little after 3. Okay. So you carried her out to the van, and then what'd you do?
And when we got to the house, we went in the house, and we talked for a minute.
She woke up.
We went in my room and talked, and she got up, messed up, and got messed up, and said, "But okay, we'll go home." And I guess she was madder than what I thought of her. And she went and just smacked me. I said, "You don't need to be doing mad stuff like that." And she started to holler at me. And I smacked her and she fell and hit her head. And I couldn't get her to wake up.
What'd she hit her head on?
Edge of a cabinet. Just put her head all over it. It wasn't on purpose at all.
Did you call or think about taking her to the hospital or anything to see if she was okay, or did you pretty much know she was dead?
She was gone.
She was gone? I understand. How were you able to clean the blood up at your house?
Wiped it up with a rag.
How much blood was there?
Puddle there on the floor. Cleaned it up. Washed the rag in the washer. I cleaned the mess up and stuff like that. I just trying to figure what I should do like that. And just cried.
Yeah.
I believed that Jay was giving me some truth as to what occurred, but there's no type of blood evidence at Jay's residence that says Linda fell back and hit her head. And with such the small amount of blood that was in the back of Jay's van, most of us believed that it was probable that Linda had been strangled. But I had to go along with him at that point, because even with the confession in this case, prosecution still could be extremely difficult with a no-body case. So I needed Jay to take us to Linda.
Put her in a tarp. Took her out to the van. I'm not nasty.
I understand. Did Jason know that you brought her to the house that night? How was she quiet enough for him not to know?
She wasn't making any noise.
Where'd you take her, Jay?
Aldrich.
How did you transport her up to the lake?
In the bed.
Okay.
Burned her.
You buried her?
Burned.
You burned her?
Burned her. I couldn't even watch her. Made me sick. I didn't know what to do. God forgive me.
How did you burn her, Jay?
Wood fire.
Did you wrap her in anything?
Blue tarp.
Where's the tarp at right now? You burned the tarp as well? Did you fish while you were burning her, or how did that happen?
Yeah, I had lines in the water.
And you just kind of had your little fire going and you're fishing and... Is she still out there?
What's left?
Are her bones still out there?
I don't think there's anything left.
I was very surprised. Even with everything that had gone on, I wasn't expecting him to say that he had burned her. I didn't know what to expect in terms of the remains or what we were going to find, but I knew getting him to take us to her body was the next phase of what needed to be done in the case.
What would you think about taking us out there and showing us exactly where it is? That way maybe we can... I figured you would. I think you're ready.
He jumped in the car with my partner and I. He took us to Stockton Lake, which is just an hour north of Springfield. And which way is it from here? Is it off to the right, Jay? Yes. Jay took us to the burn site, which was in fact the last place that he told us about where he went fishing the day that Linda went missing.
Jay, were you pointed to us by the big log there? Is that where you burned her body? Did you back the van right down next to the fire pit, or did you have to carry her a ways? Okay. Did you make that fire pit, or was it already there? It was there already? That's a big old fire pit.
We're looking in there, and upon the naked eye, there's ash there and minute amounts of bone fragment that were burned beyond recognition.
And how did you start the fire? Did you have any lighter fluid or anything that you put on there? How did you get it to where it was burned? So you didn't have anything at all that you put on there to help it burn? Plastic from the tarp, it didn't really burn good. But you didn't cut her up, nothing like that? Okay. And how long did you let it burn?
3 to 4 hours, probably.
Alright, Jay. We're going to put you in one of these patrol cars, Jay, and head back to Springfield.
In searching for Linda's remains, it was really quite shocking to see how little was left.
I've worked a lot of cases and I've had a few burnings, but I've never had one burnt to this magnitude that we were only able to find small fractions of bones.
But fortunately, I was able to send it off for testing, and the DNA testing from the bones that were recovered did in fact confirm that it was the remains of Linda.
He took her out that door and put her in a van right here. My bedroom window is right there. He was less than 12 feet that he took her out and put her in a van and drove away.
There were a lot of tears. Just like, why? Jay, he said, you loved her so much, but you murdered her. And then you stood there beside her while she burned and fished. It was horrific. It was absolutely horrific.
I did feel good about the life sentence. I knew that he would never leave jail alive, and it really meant a lot that we were able to return Linda to the family and give her a burial.
I don't understand where it came from or why. She wasn't a bad person that deserved that. She was a little person with a big heart. Her heart was about 5 times the size that she was. She had children that she loved very much.
I just feel like everybody needs to know what a good person she was. I'd like to think that she'd be here spending time with her kids and the dogs. So she'd probably be shopping at the thrift stores and trying on hats. She's this big, you know, but that hat could be this big. And she's going to try it on, and you're going to have some laughs, you know. Hopefully she'd know that her family loves her. I loved her. And we miss you every day.
I love you.
There are murders that disappear into history. And then there are murders that refuse to disappear, no matter how many years pass, no matter how many courtroom doors close, no matter how many official documents are filed away and forgotten. The murder of Pamela George is one of those cases. Her name became attached to a crime that shook Regina, Saskatchewan. But the deeper people looked, the darker the story became. Because Pamela George was not simply a woman who was found dead beside a road. She was a mother. She was Saulteaux. She came from the Sakamay First Nation. And on an Easter weekend in 1995, somewhere beyond the ordinary streets of Regina, her life was violently erased. What followed would expose something almost as disturbing as the murder itself. 2 young white university athletes would be arrested. They would admit to being with her. They would stand trial. They would be convicted. And yet, for Pamela's family and for many Indigenous people across Canada, the verdict would never feel like justice. It would feel like the beginning of another question. How could 2 men accused of brutally beating a woman to death be convicted of manslaughter rather than murder? How could the circumstances of her life become part of the argument over the value of her death? And why did it take so long for investigators to look beyond the assumptions that surrounded her? On April 17, 1995, Pamela George was alive. She was 28 years old. She had 2 children. She lived in a world where survival could mean making difficult choices. And one of those choices involved working as a prostitute. That fact would later become one of the most controversial elements of the entire case. But on that night, it was not supposed to matter. A woman went out. 2 men encountered her. A vehicle moved through the darkness. And somewhere along that journey, the night turned violent. The men were Stephen Comerfield and Alexander Ternowetsky, 19-year-old university students from middle-class white families. They were athletes. They were young. They were educated. And they were out celebrating the end of their university exams. The contrast between them and Pamela would later become central to the case. But in those first hours, there was only one thing that mattered. Pamela did not come home. By the following morning, something was terribly wrong. Her body was discovered outside Regina. She had been beaten so severely that the violence inflicted upon her became impossible to ignore. The scene was not a mystery, without clues. It was a crime scene containing the remains of a woman whose life had ended in extraordinary brutality. Yet the investigation did not immediately lead police to the two men who had been with her. Instead, investigators initially looked toward people already familiar to them, people connected to the streets, people who lived within the marginalized world where Pamela had worked. The search moved through a familiar circle of suspects: indigenous men, men associated with prostitution, men who seemed, in the eyes of investigators, to belong to the world surrounding Pamela. And this is where the case begins to reveal its most disturbing layer. The assumptions came before the answers. Pamela's occupation shaped the investigation. Her identity shaped expectations. Her social position shaped the list of people police considered likely suspects. According to later analysis of the case, investigators spent weeks following those assumptions before a tip redirected their attention. Nearly a month after Pamela's death, the investigation finally turned toward two names that would change everything: Stephen Comerfield, Alexander Ternowetsky. Two young men who did not fit the profile police had initially been pursuing. Two university athletes. Two men from respectable families. Two men who had been celebrating the end of their exams. And suddenly the case that had seemed to belong to the dark corners of Regina's streets moved directly into the center of the city's mainstream community. The arrest sent shockwaves through Regina. The men were accused of murdering Pamela George. The story was no longer about an unknown killer hiding somewhere in the city. The police now believed they had the men responsible. But having suspects was not the same as having answers. The question became what had happened inside that vehicle. What had happened after Pamela was taken away from the ordinary streets of the city? What exactly did the men do? And most importantly, what had they intended to do? Those questions would become critical years later in a courtroom. But before the trial, investigators had to reconstruct a night that had ended with Pamela's body in an isolated area. Evidence suggested that the men had taken Pamela to a remote location. There, the encounter became violent. Pamela was brutally beaten and left behind. The men then drove away. At some point afterward, they continued with their night as if they could escape what had happened. They went to eat. They traveled. They attempted to put distance between themselves and the crime. One went to British Columbia for seasonal work. The other went to Banff. But the distance did not erase the night, and the police were coming. The investigation eventually brought both men back into the center of the case. They were charged with first-degree murder. Regina now faced a question that would divide the community. If Pamela George had been killed by strangers in a random attack, perhaps the story would have been terrible enough. But this was different. The accused were young men who had grown up within the same broader society that now had to judge them. They had social advantages. They had families. They had education. They had futures. Pamela had become a dead woman beside a road. The imbalance was impossible to ignore. And as the case moved toward trial, another battle began. Not over whether Pamela had died, not over whether the two men had been with her, but over how the court would understand Pamela herself. Her occupation became a recurring issue. The prosecution and defense both dealt with the fact that she had worked as a prostitute. The label followed her into the courtroom. It became part of the narrative surrounding her. It became something that could be used to shape assumptions about what had happened that night. And that created a profound problem, because Pamela was no longer present to explain herself. She could not tell the jury what she wanted. She could not describe the encounter. She could not challenge the way strangers were describing her life. She could not correct the image created by lawyers, witnesses, headlines, or courtroom arguments. She was gone. Her killers were alive. They had lawyers. They could speak. Pamela could not. In Regina, indigenous community members watched the case with growing anger. They knew this was not simply about one woman. They saw a pattern. Indigenous women had long been vulnerable to violence, and Pamela's death appeared to demonstrate how quickly society could turn the focus away from the violence inflicted upon them and toward the lives they had lived. Her family did not see a stereotype. They saw a daughter, a mother, a human being. The courtroom would see something far more complicated, and as the trial approached, the city waited to see whether the legal system would call Pamela's death murder. The answer would eventually come from an all-white jury. But before that verdict arrived, the courtroom would become the place where two completely different versions of the same night collided. In one version, Pamela George was a vulnerable woman who had been taken to an isolated location and brutally attacked. In another, the accused were young men who had been drinking and had become involved in a terrible confrontation that they claimed had not been intended to end in death. Between those two versions stood one enormous question: when does violence become murder? And when does a court decide that a brutal death was something less? That question would soon be placed in the hands of 12 jurors. And when they finally delivered their decision, the reaction would reach far beyond the courtroom doors. Because the Pamela George case was about to become something larger than a murder trial. It was about to become a national argument over whose life the justice system considered valuable, whose story was believed, and what happens when a victim enters a courtroom carrying the weight of every stereotype society has placed upon her. The evidence would be heard. The arguments would be made. Pamela's name would be repeated again and again. But when the verdict finally came, many people would ask the same question that had haunted the case from the beginning. Had Pamela George truly received justice, or had the system found a legal way to explain away the violence done to her? The courtroom was now the center of the storm. Outside, Regina continued moving as though nothing had changed. Cars passed through intersections. Students walked across university grounds. Families went to work. Children went to school. Restaurants opened. Stores closed. Ordinary life continued. But inside the courthouse, the death of Pamela George was being dissected piece by piece. Every detail mattered. Every statement could shift the meaning of that night. And every question seemed to lead back to the same unbearable fact. Pamela was dead. Stephen Cummerfield and Alexander Ternowetsky were the last known men to have been with her. The evidence placed them together. Their own accounts connected them to Pamela. But the central legal question was not simply whether they had been there. It was whether they had intended to kill her, or whether the violence that caused her death had been something else. That distinction would determine everything. Murder required proof of the necessary intent. Manslaughter did not. And as the trial unfolded, the defense began constructing a version of events in which Pamela's death was presented not as a result of a deliberate killing, but as a tragic consequence of a violent encounter that had spiraled beyond what the accused claimed they intended. The courtroom was forced to examine the final moments of a woman who could no longer speak for herself. The men who remain alive could describe the night from their perspective. Pamela could not. Her silence was permanent. Their testimony could be challenged, questioned, compared against evidence. But Pamela's version of the encounter had disappeared with her. That imbalance became one of the defining features of the case. The prosecution sought to establish the seriousness of the attack and the circumstances surrounding Pamela's death. The defense challenged the interpretation of the evidence and the question of intent. The jury listened, and outside the courtroom, people waited. The case had already attracted attention because of the identities of the accused. 2 white university athletes stood accused of killing an indigenous woman who had worked as a prostitute. The contrast was stark. It was almost impossible for the public to discuss the case without discussing race, class, gender, and privilege. But inside the courtroom, the legal process was supposed to reduce the case to evidence and law. That was the theory. Reality was more complicated. Pamela's occupation became part of the courtroom narrative, and the fact that she had been working as a prostitute that night became impossible to separate from the way her death was being discussed. For many people, this was deeply disturbing. They believed the court was allowing the circumstances of Pamela's life to overshadow the circumstances of her death. She had made choices. She had struggled. She had worked in a dangerous environment. None of those facts explained why she had been beaten and killed. None of them erased the right she had to come home alive. But the legal arguments were not happening in a vacuum. They were happening within a society that already carried assumptions about indigenous women, about prostitution, about poverty, and about who was considered respectable. Those assumptions could enter a courtroom without being announced. They could influence the way testimony sounded. They could influence which details seemed important. They could influence how a victim was imagined. And Pamela's family was forced to watch as a woman they knew was transformed into a collection of labels: daughter, mother, indigenous woman, prostitute, victim. Each word carried a different meaning, but none captured Pamela completely. Her children did not know her as a legal category. Her family did not remember her as a headline. They knew her as Pamela, the woman whose life had been cut short. The trial moved forward. Evidence was presented. The defense maintained that the men had not intended to kill Pamela. The prosecution argued for a much more serious understanding of what had happened. The jury eventually retired to consider the case. And then came a decision that would ignite the controversy. Stephen Comerfield and Alexander Ternowetsky were not convicted of murder. They were convicted of manslaughter. For Pamela's family and supporters, the verdict landed with devastating force. The legal distinction was precise. The emotional distinction was enormous. A woman had been beaten to death. 2 men had been convicted of causing her death. But the word murder was absent from the verdict. The courtroom had reached its conclusion. The community had not. Anger spread. Indigenous activists condemned the outcome. Feminist groups questioned the way Pamela had been portrayed. The case became a symbol of what critics described as systemic prejudice in the justice system. And then came another decision that would deepen the anger. The men were sentenced to 6.5 years in prison, with credit for time already spent in custody. They had already served approximately 20 months before sentencing. To many observers, the punishment seemed painfully small when measured against the brutality of Pamela's death. The sentence became another headline, another flashpoint, another reason for people to ask whether the justice system was capable of delivering equal justice to indigenous women. The controversy did not remain inside Regina. It spread across Canada. Newspapers examined the case. Scholars studied it. Activists cited it. The trial became an example in discussions about racial inequality and the treatment of indigenous people within Canadian institutions. But Pamela's family was not studying the case. They were living with a loss that could not be reduced to legal theory. There were children who would grow up without their mother. There was a family forced to carry a memory that would never become easier simply because a court had reached a verdict. And there was a community that could not accept the idea that Pamela's life should be understood primarily through the circumstances surrounding her death. The reaction to the case became so significant that it eventually entered Canadian academic and legal discussions about the intersection of race, gender, class, and the justice system. Researchers would return to the trial again and again. They would examine the language used in court. They would analyze the treatment of Pamela's character. They would question the social assumptions surrounding the defendants. And they would ask how much Pamela's identity as an indigenous woman had influenced the way the case was understood. The story of Pamela George had become larger than the courtroom. Yet there was another question that could not be ignored. What had actually happened during those final minutes? The men had been with Pamela. She had ended up dead. The physical evidence established violence. But the exact chain of events remained contested. The accused had their own account. The prosecution had its interpretation. The jury had chosen manslaughter. And because the case had ended with convictions, there was no unsolved killer walking freely in the traditional sense. The mystery was different. It was a mystery of motive, responsibility, and justice. How could a night that ended in death begin with such ordinary circumstances? 2 young men celebrating exams, a woman working to survive, a meeting in the city, a vehicle moving into darkness, then violence, then silence, then a body. The distance between the beginning and the end was horrifyingly short. Pamela's death also forced Canadians to confront a much larger reality. Indigenous women faced disproportionate levels of violence. Their disappearances and deaths had too often failed to receive the urgency that families believed they deserved. Pamela's case became part of a broader national conversation that would continue for decades. Her name would be remembered alongside countless other Indigenous women whose lives ended violently. The details were different, the circumstances varied, but the same questions returned. Why were Indigenous women so vulnerable? Why were their cases sometimes approached with suspicion rather than urgency? Why could a victim's occupation become more important than the violence committed against her? And why did justice so often feel different depending on who stood before the court? Pamela's murder happened in 1995. Technology was different. Investigative methods were different. Public awareness was different. There were no social media platforms capable of turning a case into an instant national movement. There was no modern digital trail capable of reconstructing every movement of a suspect. But the fundamental questions were already there. Questions about prejudice. Questions about power. Questions about whose voice mattered. The courtroom had produced a legal answer. It had not produced peace. Years passed. The names of the accused slowly became less familiar to the wider public. The immediate outrage faded. Newspapers moved on to other stories. Regina changed. Buildings changed. Students graduated. New generations arrived at the university without knowing the woman whose death had once shaken the city. But Pamela's family did not have the luxury of moving on. For them, time could not turn 1995 into ancient history. Her children grew older. Their mother did not. That is one of the cruelest realities of violent death. Everyone else continues aging. The victim remains frozen at the moment life was taken. Pamela would always be 28. Her children would become adults. Her relatives would grow older. The world would keep changing around an absence that never changed, and the controversy surrounding the case would remain. In the years that followed, Pamela George became the subject of books, academic studies, documentaries, and public discussion. Her story was examined not because the identity of the killers remained unknown, but because the meaning of the verdict refused to disappear. The case became a warning about what can happen when the life of a victim is filtered through stereotypes before the full humanity of that victim is recognized. It became a reminder that a courtroom does not exist outside society. Jurors enter with experiences. Lawyers operate within cultural expectations. Witnesses carry assumptions. Victims are judged through the language available to the people describing them. And sometimes, even when a legal process reaches a conclusion, the deeper moral questions remain unanswered. Pamela George was not an unsolved murder. The men responsible for her death were identified and convicted, but the case left behind another kind of unresolved question. What does justice mean when the punishment feels disconnected from the life that was lost? What does accountability mean when the victim's own character becomes part of the argument? And what happens when a community believes that the law has answered the wrong question? Those questions followed Pamela's name long after the courthouse doors closed. They became part of her legacy. Not because she chose it, not because she wanted to become a symbol, but because her death forced people to confront a reality they could no longer comfortably ignore. Pamela George had lived on the margins of society. Her killers had not. And when the justice system placed both stories before a jury, the outcome revealed how deeply those differences could shape the meaning of a crime. The case was over in the legal sense, but it was not over in the public imagination. It could not be, because somewhere beneath every argument about evidence, intent, sentencing, and law was a simple fact that required no legal interpretation at all. Pamela George was alive when the night began. She was someone's daughter, someone's mother, someone's sister, a woman with a future that had not yet happened. By sunrise, that future was gone, and decades later, the most haunting part of the story was not that no one knew who had killed her. They did. The haunting part was that everyone knew her name, everyone knew how she died, and yet people were still arguing over what her life was worth. The verdict did not end the story. It changed the question. Once the courtroom doors closed, the attention moved away from the two men standing accused and towards something much larger, something far more difficult to prosecute because it had no single defendant, no single crime scene, no single night that could be marked on a calendar. The question became what Pamela George's death revealed about the society around her. Regina had witnessed the trial. Canada had witnessed something else, a collision between race and class, between gender and power, between the image of a respectable young man and the image of an Indigenous woman who survived through prostitution. And in that collision, Pamela's voice had been missing from the room. She could not explain the night. She could not defend her choices. She could not tell the jury what she believed was happening when she entered that vehicle. She could not tell them whether she was frightened. She could not tell them what she wanted. The people speaking about her had to reconstruct her life from fragments. And those fragments were filtered through assumptions that had existed long before Pamela ever walked into that courtroom. That was what made the case so disturbing. The verdict was legally final, but socially it opened another investigation. Journalists began asking questions that the original trial could not answer. Academics returned to the transcripts. Activists examined the language used to describe Pamela. Feminists questioned whether her occupation had been allowed to define her humanity. Indigenous leaders pointed toward a much broader history of violence against Indigenous women. Pamela George was no longer only a victim in a criminal case. She had become a symbol of a system that many people believed had failed to see her as a whole person. Her death exposed the enormous distance between legal procedure and human grief. The law could determine a conviction. It could determine a sentence. It could define the offense. But it could not determine what Pamela's children would feel when they reached an age at which they could fully understand what had happened to their mother. It could not restore the years they lost. It could not erase the image of Pamela being found dead. And it could not make the 6.5-year sentence feel proportional to a life that had disappeared forever. The reaction to the sentence was immediate and intense. Demonstrators gathered. Indigenous organizations spoke out. Women's groups condemned what they regarded as a failure of justice. The case became a rallying point because Pamela's death seemed to fit into a pattern that had been ignored for too long. Indigenous women were often exposed to violence at rates far higher than other women. Their families frequently struggled to get the same level of attention and urgency that surrounded cases involving victims from more privileged communities. Pamela's story gave that inequality a face. She was no longer an abstract statistic. She had a name, a photograph, children, a family, a history, a voice that others now tried to recover. But recovering her voice was difficult because so much of the public discussion had been dominated by the circumstances of her death. The woman became secondary to the case. The case became secondary to the controversy. And the controversy threatened to consume the woman entirely. That is one of the strangest things that can happen after a violent crime. The victim can become famous for the very thing that destroyed her. Pamela's identity became attached to the night she died. Yet her life had existed long before April 1995. She had childhood memories, relationships, hopes, difficulties, moments of happiness, moments of fear, ordinary days that never appeared in a police report. The official record preserved the crime. It could never fully preserve the person. And perhaps that was why the story refused to settle. People were not only angry about the verdict, they were angry about what the verdict seemed to say about whose story deserved to be believed. The defense had succeeded in creating doubt about the level of intent. The jury had accepted manslaughter rather than murder. The legal system had followed its rules. But the public response suggested that following rules was not always enough to create a sense of justice. A courtroom can be procedurally correct and still leave a community feeling morally wounded. That tension became central to the legacy of the Pamela George case. Years later, researchers would study the trial as an example of how race, gender, and class intersect inside criminal proceedings. They would examine the way Indigenous victims are represented. They would explore how prostitution affects perceptions of credibility and vulnerability. They would ask why society often judges the circumstances of a woman's life before judging the violence inflicted upon her. These were not questions limited to Pamela's case. They belonged to a larger Canadian conversation, and that conversation would become increasingly difficult to ignore. The 1990s were a period when public awareness of violence against Indigenous women was beginning to shift, but the transformation was slow. Families had been demanding answers for years. Communities had been warning authorities for years. Yet the national response often arrived only after individual cases became impossible to ignore. Pamela's murder was one of those cases. Her death became part of a history that extended beyond Regina, beyond Saskatchewan, and beyond the courtroom where two men were convicted. The case also raised questions about masculinity and privilege. Comerfield and Ternowetsky were young. They were university athletes. They had futures that appeared promising. Their social identities gave the public an image of two young men who should have been headed toward ordinary adulthood. Pamela's life was presented through a very different frame. That contrast mattered. It affected how people interpreted the crime before the verdict and how they interpreted the sentence afterward. The two worlds seemed almost impossible to reconcile. One represented opportunity. The other represented survival. One was associated with university life and athletic achievement. The other was associated with poverty, marginalization, and street-level prostitution. And when violence brought those two worlds together, the result was fatal. The tragedy was not simply that two individuals made terrible choices. The deeper tragedy was that society already possessed a hierarchy of respectability before the crime occurred. Some lives were easier to imagine as promising. Others were easier to imagine as disposable. Pamela's death forced Canadians to confront that uncomfortable distinction. The men were convicted. Their futures changed. But they remained alive. Pamela did not. That difference would never disappear. The years continued. The men eventually completed their sentences and returned to society. Pamela remained absent. Her children grew older without the possibility of asking their mother questions that only she could answer. Her family carried memories that became more precious with time. The physical places connected to the case changed. Roads were altered. Buildings were demolished or renovated. New people moved into the city. Yet somewhere in the collective memory of Regina, the case remained. A young woman had been found dead. Two young men had been convicted. And the verdict had opened a wound that never completely closed. The story became part of university discussions. It appeared in scholarship. It was examined in legal education. It entered conversations about indigenous rights and violence against women. The names associated with the case continued to appear in academic writing long after newspaper headlines had disappeared from public view. Pamela's death had become a case study, but there was something deeply uncomfortable about that phrase. A case study is something examined from a distance. Pamela was never distant to the people who loved her. She was their family. Their memories were not theoretical. Their grief was not academic. And their anger was not simply an argument about legal doctrine. It came from the fact that the woman they loved had been reduced to a courtroom narrative that they believed did not capture who she really was. That distinction matters. A victim can become evidence. A person can become a file number. A life can become a sequence of dates and photographs and medical findings. But behind every document is a human being. Pamela's story forced people to look behind the documents. It forced them to ask who she had been before the final night. It forced them to confront the fact that the most important details about a victim's life are often the details that never appear in court. The favorite song, the childhood memory, the joke she told, the way she spoke to her children, the small habits that made her recognizable to those who loved her. None of those things can prove murder. None can establish intent. None can determine a sentence. But they are the pieces that make a human life. And Pamela had a life. That fact became increasingly important as her story entered public discussion. She could not be allowed to exist only as the woman who was murdered. She had to be remembered as the woman who lived. That shift in perspective changed the emotional meaning of the case. It was no longer simply about the men who had been convicted. It was about Pamela herself, her life, her children, her community, her identity, and the society that had failed to protect her. The case also became a warning about how quickly assumptions can distort an investigation. Investigators initially focused on suspects who appear to fit a familiar profile. The investigation eventually moved in another direction only after a tip pointed toward Comerfield and Ternowetsky. That early misdirection became one of the most revealing aspects of the case. It showed how investigators can be influenced by expectations before all the facts are known. When a victim comes from a marginalized community, There's a danger that investigators will unconsciously search for explanations that fit stereotypes. The person who is missing becomes associated with the environment in which they lived. The people around them become suspects because they belong to the same social world. Meanwhile, individuals outside that world can receive less scrutiny because they appear respectable. Pamela's case demonstrated the danger of that approach. The investigation eventually reached the men responsible, but the delay itself became part of the story. It showed how assumptions can shape the direction of an investigation before evidence has had a chance to speak. And perhaps the most haunting aspect is that none of these questions can change what happened to Pamela. No later analysis can return her to her children. No academic paper can undo the violence. No public apology can restore the years that were stolen. The law can punish. Society can remember. History can examine. But none of them can reverse death. That is why the case continues to resonate. It is not unresolved because the killers remain unknown. It is unresolved because the moral questions surrounding the death have no simple ending. Was the legal distinction between murder and manslaughter enough to reflect the violence that occurred? Was the sentence sufficient? Did the trial treat Pamela with the dignity she deserved? Did stereotypes influence the way the jury understood her? And how much did race and class shape the entire process? Decades later, people can still disagree about the answers, but the questions remain. And perhaps that is the reason Pamela George's name has survived when so many other crime stories have disappeared. Her death became a mirror. People looked at the case and saw different things. Some saw a criminal prosecution. Some saw a miscarriage of justice. Some saw systemic racism. Some saw misogyny. Some saw the devastating vulnerability of indigenous women. Some saw a young woman whose life should never have ended the way it did. But beneath all those interpretations was one undeniable truth. Pamela George should have lived. She should have watched her children grow. She should have had ordinary mornings and difficult afternoons and uneventful evenings. She should have had more years, more choices, more mistakes, more laughter, more time. Instead, her story was cut short in the darkness outside Regina. And when the courts finally delivered their verdict, they could define what the men were guilty of. They could not define the value of the life that had been taken. That question belonged to everyone who heard Pamela's story. And for many people, the answer was painfully clear. The value of Pamela's life was never determined by the work she did, the circumstances she lived in, or the assumptions others made about her. It existed because she was human, because she was a mother, because she was loved, because she mattered. The tragedy of the case is that this should never have needed to be said. Yet decades later, the fact that it still needs to be said is perhaps the most enduring indictment left behind by the murder of Pamela George. The courtroom had delivered its verdict, but the silence that followed was anything but peaceful. For Pamela George's family, there was no closing argument that could close the wound. No sentence could restore the years stolen from her children. No legal distinction between murder and manslaughter could change the image that had been burned into the minds of those who knew what had happened. The case was officially finished, but outside the courthouse, another process was beginning. People were asking why Pamela's life had been examined so relentlessly, while the circumstances that made her vulnerable had received so little attention. Why had her occupation become such a powerful part of the story? Why had assumptions about indigenous people influenced the early direction of the investigation? And why did the punishment appear so small beside the violence that had ended her life? These questions did not disappear when the defendants entered prison. They followed the case into the years ahead. The murder of Pamela George became something that could no longer be contained within a criminal file. It became part of a much larger conversation about indigenous women in Canada and about a justice system that many believed had treated Pamela differently because of who she was. The most painful part was that Pamela had never asked to become a symbol. She had not chosen to become a national example. She had simply been trying to live. She was 28 years old. She was raising children. She was navigating a difficult world. And on one night in Regina, her life collided with the lives of two young men who would later be convicted in connection with her death. The consequences would follow everyone involved, but only one person paid with her life. The case also forced attention onto the investigation itself. At first, police had reportedly concentrated on suspects from Pamela's own social environment. That direction was understandable in the most superficial sense. Investigators often begin with people who knew a victim or who live within the same circles. But when the victim belongs to a marginalized community, that instinct can become dangerous. A social network can quickly become a stereotype. A neighborhood can become a suspect pool. An occupation can become an explanation. Pamela had worked as a prostitute. That fact was known. It became part of how authorities and the public imagined the circumstances surrounding her death. But working as a prostitute did not make her death less violent. It did not make her less deserving of protection. It did not make her less worthy of investigation. And it certainly did not give anyone permission to hurt her. Yet those basic truths had to fight against decades of social prejudice. Pamela's case demonstrated how easily a victim can be judged according to the circumstances of her life rather than the circumstances of her death. It also demonstrated how an investigation can become vulnerable when investigators unconsciously accept the idea that some victims are simply more exposed to danger than others. The assumption may sound practical. It can be devastating. If danger is considered normal for a particular group of people, then the disappearance or death of one person from that group can receive less urgency. The extraordinary becomes ordinary. The warning signs become background noise. And the victim becomes another statistic instead of an emergency. Pamela was not a statistic to her family. She was not a category. She was not a profession. She was not a stereotype. She was a woman whose absence changed the lives of everyone who loved her. Her children would grow up carrying memories of a mother who could never grow older beside them. Birthdays would arrive. School years would pass. Milestones would come. The world would continue producing moments in which Pamela should have been present. Graduation photographs, family celebrations, ordinary conversations, questions about the past. Each moment could carry the same invisible absence. This is what violence does to families. It does not end when the police leave the crime scene. It does not end when the courtroom reaches a verdict. It changes the shape of time. The future becomes divided into everything that happened before and everything that happened after. For Pamela's children, the future continued. Pamela did not. That difference can never be repaired. And the public debate around the case became increasingly intense because of the identities of the two men convicted. They were young. They were white. They were university students and athletes. They came from backgrounds that, to many observers, appeared far removed from the world in which Pamela had lived. That contrast became one of the most discussed aspects of the case. It was not simply a story about two individuals. It was a story about two social worlds that rarely occupied the same moral space in the public imagination. One world was associated with education, opportunity, and respectable futures. The other was associated with poverty, prostitution, and indigenous marginalization. When those worlds collided, the public was forced to confront the possibility that the justice system itself might carry assumptions about which world was more credible, more valuable, or more worthy of sympathy. The reaction was not limited to anger over verdict. It became a debate about language. The way Pamela was described mattered. The words used to describe her occupation mattered. The words used to describe the accused mattered. Every label carried a history. A university athlete was more than an athlete. A prostitute was more than a prostitute. An indigenous woman was more than an indigenous woman. But public narratives often compress people into a few recognizable characteristics because those characteristics make stories easier to tell. Pamela's tragedy was that those simplifications could become powerful enough to influence how her death was understood. The more people examine the case, the more they recognize the danger of reducing a human being to a role. That realization helped propel Pamela's story beyond the immediate courtroom controversy. Scholars began examining the case through the lenses of race, gender, class, and colonialism. Legal scholars considered the way indigenous identity and prostitution intersected with perceptions of credibility and victimhood. Feminist scholars examined how the treatment of Pamela reflected broader attitudes toward women who worked in the sex trade. Indigenous scholars and activists placed the case within a much longer history of violence against indigenous women. The The murder became part of an intellectual record because it exposed several systems at once. It showed that discrimination does not always arrive as an explicit statement. Sometimes it appears through expectations, through what investigators assume, through what jurors find believable, through which details receive attention, through which victims receive sympathy, through the quiet hierarchy of whose suffering feels shocking and whose suffering has become normalized. Pamela's death was shocking, but the response to it revealed another uncomfortable truth. Society had become accustomed to hearing about violence against women who lived on the margins: indigenous women, sex workers, poor women, women whose lives were complicated, women whose choices did not fit conventional ideas of respectability. When such women disappeared, there was a danger that their disappearance would be interpreted as an unfortunate consequence of their lifestyle, rather than as a crime demanding the full force of the justice system. Pamela's case challenged that thinking. Her occupation might explain the environment in which she worked. It could never explain why she was killed. The passage of time only strengthened the symbolic power of the case. The immediate headlines faded. The courthouse became part of the past. The men convicted in connection with Pamela's death served their sentences and eventually returned to civilian life. But Pamela remained at the center of discussions about justice for indigenous women. Her name appeared in academic work and public conversations because the questions surrounding her death were larger than the individuals involved. The case became a warning about what happens when social prejudice enters a criminal investigation. It became a warning about the danger of assuming that a victim's lifestyle makes violence against her inevitable, and it became a warning about the distance between legal justice and social justice. There was another dimension that made the case particularly difficult to forget. The men were convicted of manslaughter rather than murder. That distinction meant that the jury did not find the prosecution had established the necessary intent for murder beyond a reasonable doubt. Legally, that mattered enormously. It was not a technicality. It was the central question of the trial. But for people outside the courtroom, the distinction could feel almost impossible to accept. Pamela was brutally beaten and died as a result. The word used to classify the crime could not change that reality. For her family, the difference between legal definitions and lived experience was enormous. The law had spoken. Grief had not. And that is where the case continued to live. Not in the mystery of an unknown killer. Not in a hidden identity waiting to be discovered. The identities of the men had become known. They had been arrested. They had stood trial. They had been convicted. The mystery was not who had been responsible. The mystery was how a society could look at the same facts and arrive at such different understandings of justice. To some, the legal process had reached a legitimate conclusion. To others, the process itself exposed a deeper failure. Both perspectives could exist at the same time. That tension was part of what made the case so enduring. Pamela's story also became a reminder that justice cannot always be measured by a courtroom result. A conviction is important. Accountability matters. But justice also includes the way a victim is treated before, during, and after a trial. It includes whether her humanity is preserved. It includes whether her family is heard. It includes whether society learns from what happened. If a case produces a conviction but leaves the same prejudices untouched, then the legal process may have ended while the underlying problem remains. Years after Pamela's death, Canada would continue confronting the disproportionate violence experienced by Indigenous women and girls. Families across the country would continue demanding answers. Investigations would be reopened. National attention would grow. The issue would become impossible to dismiss as a collection of isolated tragedies. Pamela's name belonged to an earlier chapter of that conversation, but it remained relevant because her case demonstrated many of the same tensions that would later dominate the national debate. The image that survives is not simply a crime scene. It is a young mother whose life stopped while everyone else's continued. That is the cruel mathematics of murder. One person loses every future possibility. Everyone else receives another morning, another year, another decade. Pamela never received any of them. Her children did. Her family did. Regina did. Canada did. History did. And with every passing year, The distance between Pamela's final night and the present grew larger, but the central fact remained exactly where it had always been. She should have survived that night. She should have returned home. She should have watched her children grow. She should have been allowed to become older than 28. Instead, her name became attached to one of the most controversial criminal cases in Saskatchewan's history. And the more the case was studied, the clearer it became that the story was never only about what happened in a vehicle on a dark road outside Regina. It was about what happened before that night, what society believed about Pamela, what investigators expected to find, what the courtroom was willing to hear, what the public considered important, and what happened afterward when two families experienced the same case from opposite sides of a line that could never be crossed. For Pamela's family, the years could not make the loss ordinary. They could only make it older. The questions remained. The anger changed shape. The public conversation evolved. But her absence remained absolute. And perhaps that is why the case still carries such weight decades later. Not because the identity of the perpetrators remains unknown. Not because the evidence disappeared. Not because the courtroom failed to reach a verdict. It remains because a verdict can close a legal case without closing the questions that surround it. Pamela George was murdered in 1995. The courtroom eventually decided what the accused were guilty of. But history continued asking what Pamela's life had been worth. And that question could never be answered by a sentence measured in years. The years did not erase Pamela George. They changed the way people remembered her. At first, she was the woman at the center of a murder investigation. Then she became the victim in a controversial trial. Then she became a name repeated by activists, scholars, journalists, and indigenous communities searching for language to describe a problem that was far larger than one courtroom. But underneath every interpretation remained the same human tragedy. Pamela had been alive, then she was not. And between those two facts was a night that would permanently alter the lives of everyone connected to her. The details of that night were brutally simple. Pamela was working as a prostitute in Regina. She encountered two young men. She entered their vehicle. She was taken away from the familiar streets. At some point, the encounter became violent. Pamela was beaten. Her body was abandoned. The men left the area. By morning, the city had another crime scene. Another family had another unanswered question. Another indigenous woman had become a victim of violence. But what happened next revealed how difficult it can be to investigate a death when the victim belongs to a marginalized community. The first assumption surrounding Pamela's murder mattered. Investigators did not immediately identify Comerfield and Ternowetsky as the men responsible. The investigation moved through other possibilities. Suspicion initially fell on people associated with Pamela's world. The process reflected an assumption that seemed logical on the surface, but carried a dangerous flaw. The people around a victim are not automatically the people who killed her. A month passed before information redirected investigators toward the two university students. That delay became part of the story. It showed how a case can be shaped by the first theory investigators develop. Once a theory takes hold, evidence can begin to move around it. Investigators look for confirmation. Witnesses are interpreted through the existing narrative. Certain possibilities appear more believable than others. And when the victim herself comes from a world that authorities already associate with danger, the investigation can become trapped inside that world. Pamela's occupation made the situation even more complicated. She had been working on the streets. That fact was not hidden, but it became one of the most powerful details associated with her after her death. Her occupation could be described as a circumstance. Instead, it became part of her public identity. The woman disappeared behind the label. That distinction became central to the outrage surrounding the trial. There's a fundamental difference between explaining how a person came to be in a dangerous situation and suggesting that the person therefore carried some responsibility for what happened to her. Pamela's life could be difficult. Her work could expose her to danger. Her social circumstances could be complicated. None of those facts changed the basic equation. She had the right to survive. The people who loved her understood that immediately. The justice system had to confront it through evidence and law. The public confronted it through emotion. And those three perspectives did not always point in the same direction. When the case reached trial, the defense sought to challenge the prosecution's interpretation of events. The central question was intent. Murder and manslaughter were not interchangeable under Canadian law. The prosecution had to establish the elements necessary for murder. The defense sought to create reasonable doubt about that level of intent. That legal battle was crucial. But for people watching from outside, another battle was taking place. What kind of story was being told about Pamela? Was she primarily a victim of a brutal attack? Or was she being presented through the circumstances of her life? Was the courtroom examining the violence inflicted upon her? Or was it examining the decisions she had made before the violence occurred? The distinction was not academic to Pamela's family. It was everything. Because once a victim is dead, the only thing left of her in court is the story other people construct. She cannot interrupt. She cannot correct a misleading description. She cannot explain why she made a decision. She cannot tell the jury what she feared. She cannot say what she wanted. Her silence becomes permanent, while the accused retain the ability to speak through lawyers, testimony, evidence, and argument. That imbalance can be devastating. Pamela's life had to be reconstructed by people who had never lived it. Her children knew a different Pamela. Her relatives knew a different Pamela. Her community knew a different Pamela. The courtroom knew fragments. And fragments can be dangerous when they become the whole story. The case became particularly painful because of the stark difference between Pamela and the men accused in connection with her death. They were young university students. They were athletes. They came from families and circumstances that appeared far removed from the world Pamela inhabited. To many observers, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Two worlds. One encounter. One dead woman. Two defendants. One courtroom. And a verdict that will reverberate far beyond Regina. When the jury ultimately found Comerfield and Ternowetsky guilty of manslaughter rather than murder, the legal process had reached its conclusion. But for many people, the verdict created another crisis of confidence. How could a woman be beaten to death and the resulting conviction be something other than murder? The answer lay in the legal question of intent. But grief does not speak the language of legal definitions. Pamela's family did not wake up every morning thinking about the distinction between murder and manslaughter. They woke up knowing she was gone. Her children did not receive their mother back because the jury had chosen one legal classification over another. The sentence did not restore her future. The verdict did not erase the violence. And the prison term did not make the absence disappear. The sentence was 6.5 years. The defendants had already spent roughly 20 months in custody before sentencing, which was credited toward their punishment. To many members of the public, the punishment appeared profoundly inadequate. The anger intensified. Demonstrators protested. Indigenous leaders spoke. Women's organizations condemned the treatment of Pamela. The case moved beyond the boundaries of criminal law and into the territory of social justice. Pamela's death was now being discussed alongside a larger question. Why were Indigenous women so vulnerable to violence? The question had no simple answer. There were historical forces, economic forces, social forces, colonial policies, poverty, racism, gender inequality, marginalization. Each factor existed within a complicated network of others. But the existence of complexity could not become an excuse for inaction. The murder of one woman had exposed a much larger vulnerability. Pamela was not the first Indigenous woman to experience violence. She would not be the last. And that reality made the case increasingly difficult to forget. In the years after the trial, Pamela's name continued appearing in academic discussions and public debates. Researchers examined the case because it represented a collision of several forms of inequality: Indigenous identity, gender, poverty, prostitution, criminal justice, media representation. Each subject could be studied separately. Together, they created a disturbing picture. The case demonstrated how a person's social status can affect the way others interpret their vulnerability. A woman considered respectable may disappear and immediately generate alarm. A woman working on the streets may disappear and face assumptions about where she went and why. Those assumptions can influence police investigations. They can influence media coverage. They can influence public sympathy. And they can influence how a victim is remembered. That was one of the most painful lessons associated with Pamela's death. The danger was not simply that someone had killed her. The danger was that society might have been prepared to understand her death as something less shocking because of who she was. That possibility haunted the case. It also transformed Pamela into a symbol. But symbols can create another problem. When a person becomes a symbol, the individual can disappear again. Pamela became a symbol of indigenous women's vulnerability, a symbol of racism, a symbol of sexism, a symbol of injustice, a symbol of the failures of the justice system. All of those interpretations had meaning. But Pamela was still Pamela. She had a childhood. She had a family. She had relationships. She had children. She had an identity that existed before the headlines. She was more than the night she died. That fact became increasingly important as her story traveled through time. The public tend to remember violent deaths through their most dramatic details: the location, the injuries, the suspects, the courtroom, the verdict. But a life is not dramatic every day. Most of Pamela's life had consisted of ordinary moments. Those moments rarely make headlines. There are no news cameras at ordinary breakfasts. No reporters record ordinary conversations. No forensic team documents ordinary laughter. No courtroom exhibits capture the way a mother looks at her children. Yet those are the moments that make up a life. When Pamela was killed, all of them ended at once. Her children continued living. Her family continued living. Her community continued living. But Pamela's timeline stopped. 28. Forever. The men convicted in connection with her death eventually served their sentences. They eventually left prison. The world moved forward. Pamela could not. That difference became one of the most haunting aspects of the case. The defendants had a before and an after. Pamela had only a before. Her family had an after that they never wanted. And the community had a memory that refused to disappear. The case also forced Canadians to confront the way privilege can influence perceptions of innocence. No one enters a courtroom as a blank page. Jurors bring their experiences. Lawyers choose their language. Witnesses remember events imperfectly. Investigators make assumptions. Journalists select details. Readers absorb narratives. None of this means a verdict is automatically wrong. It means justice happens inside society. And society carries its prejudices into the courtroom. That was one of the reasons Pamela's case continued to receive attention long after the defendants had served their sentences. People were not only asking whether the legal process had followed the rules, they were asking whether the rules were operating inside a system capable of seeing Pamela clearly. That question was harder. There was no single answer, no single villain, no single moment when everything went wrong. Instead, there were layers. An investigation shaped by assumptions. A victim described through stereotypes. A courtroom wrestling with questions of intent. A jury reaching a legal conclusion. A sentence that many considered too lenient. A family left behind. A community demanding recognition. And decades of discussion afterward. The case had become a chain of consequences. One decision leading to another. One assumption influencing another. One night creating years of questions. And beneath everything was a woman whose name had become synonymous with the controversy. Pamela George. She had not asked to become a case. She had not asked to become a symbol. She had not asked to become a subject of academic research. She had simply lived. Then someone took that life away. And the fact that her death became a national discussion could never compensate for what was lost. That is a cruel paradox of cases like Pamela's. The world may learn from a victim's death, but the victim never gets the benefit from the lesson. The community may become more aware. The justice system may be forced to confront its failures. Future investigations may become more sensitive. Public attitudes may change. But Pamela herself receives none of it. She remains at the beginning of the story. 28 years old, a mother, an indigenous woman, a human being, alive in the memories of those who knew her, and forever absent from a future that should have belonged to her. The murder of Pamela George was eventually given a legal conclusion, but the questions it raised were much harder to bury, because a courtroom can determine guilt. It cannot determine whether society valued a victim enough. It cannot sentence prejudice. It cannot imprison indifference. It cannot restore a childhood memory to a motherless child. And it cannot return a woman to the people waiting for her to come home. That was the shadow Pamela left behind. Not a mystery about who killed her. Not an unsolved identity. But a question about what happened when the justice system finally looked at her death, and whether, in looking at the crime, it ever fully saw the woman. The further Pamela George's story traveled from the courtroom, the more difficult it became to separate the woman from the controversy that had grown around her death. Her name appeared in newspapers, academic studies, documentaries, and public debates, but every repetition carried a danger. The more people talked about Pamela as an example, the easier it became to forget that before she was a case, she had been a person. Before lawyers debated her life, she had lived it. Before investigators photographed the evidence surrounding her death, she had occupied a place in the lives of people who loved her. Before journalists reduced a tragedy to headlines, Pamela had been a mother whose children expected her to remain part of their future. That future vanished in a single night. Everything afterward was an attempt to understand the absence. The tragedy was that understanding could never become restoration. No investigation could give Pamela another morning. No courtroom argument could give her children another conversation with their mother. No academic study could replace the ordinary experiences that death had stolen. The only thing society could do was examine what had happened and decide whether it was willing to learn from it. That process proved painfully slow. Pamela's story entered public memory during a period when Canada was beginning to confront uncomfortable truths about the treatment of Indigenous people. But those truths had existed for generations. Indigenous communities have been warning about violence, poverty, discrimination, and institutional neglect long before Pamela's name became nationally recognized. Her death did not create those problems. It exposed them. And exposure can be dangerous because once something hidden becomes visible, people have to decide what they will do about it. Some wanted the case remembered as a criminal tragedy. Others wanted it remembered as evidence of systemic failure. Some focused on the conduct of the two men. Others focused on the treatment of Pamela. Some believed the legal distinction between murder and manslaughter was justified by the evidence. Others believed the verdict reflected a profound failure to recognize the severity of the violence. The arguments could become complicated. Pamela's death was not. She was dead. Her family was grieving. Her children were growing up without her. Those facts remained untouched by every legal debate. The controversy surrounding the case also revealed how dangerous it can be when a victim's occupation becomes a substitute for her identity. Pamela had worked as a prostitute. That fact was relevant to understanding the circumstances in which she encountered the men. But relevance can quickly become judgment, and judgment can become dehumanization. A prostitute is still a person. An Indigenous woman is still a person. A poor woman is still a person. A woman struggling with circumstances that others may not understand is still a person. These statements sound obvious, yet the history of violence against marginalized women demonstrates how often societies fail to act as though they are obvious. The concept of respectability can quietly determine how seriously a victim is treated. A victim perceived as innocent is often imagined differently from one perceived as having lived a dangerous or unconventional life. One receives sympathy immediately. The other may be subjected to questions. Why was she there? Why did she go with them? Why did she work there? Why did she make that choice? Why didn't she leave? Questions about a victim can appear neutral, but when asked after a violent crime, they can shift attention away from the person who committed the violence. Pamela's case became a powerful example of that problem. The central question should have been what happened to her. Instead, public discussion repeatedly returned to who she had been. There was a cruel irony in that. The more society tried to explain Pamela, the less room there sometimes seemed to be for Pamela herself. She became a collection of facts. 28 years old. Indigenous. Mother. Prostitute. Murder victim. But people are never just facts. A person contains contradictions, memories, relationships, fear, humor, ambition, regret, love, anger, ordinary routines, private dreams. Pamela had all those things, but most of them disappeared from the public record because they were irrelevant to proving a criminal charge. That is one of the limitations of a courtroom. A courtroom is designed to determine specific legal questions. It is not designed to tell the complete story of a human life. That distinction matters enormously in cases involving marginalized victims. The law asks whether a crime occurred. The family asks why. The community asks what it means. History asks what it reveals. And Pamela's case generated all four questions at once. As the years passed, the legal details became less familiar to the general public. The emotional impact did not disappear, but it changed. The immediate anger surrounding the sentence became part of a longer conversation about Indigenous women and girls. Activists continued demanding greater attention to missing and murdered Indigenous women. Researchers examined patterns of violence. Governments and institutions faced increasing pressure to acknowledge systemic problems. Pamela's name existed within that expanding conversation. She was one woman, but her story represented many. That was both powerful and painful. Powerful because her death helped people recognize a broader problem. Painful because becoming a symbol meant that Pamela's individuality could once again be lost. Her family had to watch the woman they knew become a public argument. Different groups claimed the case for different purposes. Some used it to criticize the justice system. Some used it to discuss racism. Some used it to discuss violence against sex workers. Some used it to examine the experiences of Indigenous women. Some used it to examine the treatment of victims in court. All of those discussions were legitimate. But Pamela was more than the lesson others extracted from her death. The question of memory therefore became important. How should Pamela be remembered? As the woman whose killers were convicted? As the Indigenous woman whose case exposed racism? As the mother whose children lost her? As the prostitute whose occupation became part of a controversial trial? As a symbol of violence against Indigenous women? The answer should have been all of these, but never only one. Because reducing her to a single identity would repeat the same mistake that had haunted the case from the beginning. Pamela had a life before the crime. That life deserved to exist in the story. Her family carried those memories even when the public did not know them. They knew the person behind the headlines. They understood that she had experienced difficult circumstances without being defined by them. They understood that her choices did not make her responsible for someone else's violence. That distinction is crucial. A person's vulnerability does not transfer responsibility for violence onto the victim. If someone works in a dangerous environment, the danger does not become permission. If someone struggles with poverty, poverty does not erase their rights. If someone makes choices others dislike, those choices do not make them less human. Pamela's death forced those principles into public conversation because so many people believed the system had failed to protect them. And the issue went beyond one police investigation. It involved a cultural hierarchy that could determine who seemed believable. That hierarchy can be subtle. It does not always appear as hatred. Sometimes it appears as indifference. Sometimes it appears as lowered expectations. Sometimes it appears as a belief that violence is simply part of life for certain people. That may be one of the most dangerous assumptions of all. When violence becomes expected, it becomes easy to overlook. When a community is accustomed to women disappearing, disappearance can become normalized. When victims are repeatedly associated with poverty, addiction, prostitution, or other stigmatized circumstances, society can begin to treat their suffering as inevitable. Pamela's story challenged that normalization. Her death was not inevitable. It was not an unavoidable consequence of her work. It was not the natural result of living on the margins. It was a violent act. And someone was responsible. The legal system eventually identified and convicted the two men connected to her death. But responsibility in the broader sense became more complicated. Could society accept responsibility for the assumptions that shaped the early investigation? Could institutions accept responsibility for the ways marginalized victims were perceived? Could the public accept responsibility for demanding more from the justice system? Could people remember Pamela without turning her into a stereotype? Those questions did not have a courtroom answer. They required cultural change. And cultural change is slow. It does not happen with one verdict. It happens through thousands of conversations, through journalists choosing different language, through investigators recognizing their own assumptions, through lawyers challenging stereotypes, through communities demanding accountability, through families refusing to let victims disappear into statistics. Pamela's family did not allow her to become just another forgotten name. That persistence mattered. Because time can erase public memory. The details of old crimes disappear. People forget the names of prosecutors. They forget the names of judges. They forget the arguments made by lawyers. They forget the headlines. But the victim's name can survive if someone continues saying it. Pamela. Not the case. Not the controversy. Pamela. That single word represented an entire life. The passing years also created another painful contrast. The men convicted in connection with her death had eventually completed their sentences. Their lives could continue. They could move through the world without being permanently frozen at the age they were when the crime occurred. Pamela could not. She remained 28 forever. Her children could grow older. Her friends could grow older. Her relatives could grow older. The city could grow and change. Canada could change. Pamela remained in 1995. That is what violent death does. It creates a permanent separation between the victim and the future. Every year afterward becomes a year the victim never experienced. 29, 30, 35, 40, 50, 60. Those ages belong to other people. Pamela never reached them. The thought is simple, but devastating. A person can imagine a future in countless ways. Pamela might have changed careers. She might have moved. She might have reconciled with someone. She might have watched her children build lives of their own. She might have become a grandmother. She might have grown older and looked back at the difficult years of her youth from a completely different place. None of those possibilities can be recovered. Death does not only remove the present, it removes every possible future. That is why statistics can never fully describe murder. A statistic records one death. A human life contains millions of possibilities. Pamela lost all of them, and her children lost the possibility of experiencing those years with her. That loss became one of the quietest parts of the story. The public remembered the trial. The family remembered the mother. Those are not the same memory. One is built from evidence. The other is built from love. Perhaps that is why the case continued to hurt long after the legal process ended. The courtroom could produce a conclusion, but it could not produce closure. Closure is often misunderstood. People say a case is closed when a suspect is arrested, a trial is completed, and a sentence is imposed. But for families, closure may not exist in such a simple form. The dead do not return. The missing years do not return. The unanswered emotional questions remain. Why her? Why that night? Why did no one protect her? Why did the investigation take the path it did? Why did the sentence feel so short? Why did her occupation matter so much? Why did the system seem unable to see the woman beyond the label? These questions are not solved by a verdict. They become part of the family's inheritance. And Pamela's family inherited them in 1995. They carried them into every year that followed. The public could move on. The family could not. That is another reason true justice cannot be measured only by punishment. Punishment concerns the offender. Justice must also concern the victim's dignity, the victim's family, the victim's memory, the victim's place in history. Pamela's story forced Canada to consider those dimensions because a conventional legal conclusion felt insufficient to many people. The men were convicted, but Pamela remained dead. The sentence was served, but the family remained without her. The headlines faded, but the questions remained. And eventually, the case became something that could not be reduced to a single verdict. It became a warning about assumptions, a warning about stereotypes, a warning about how quickly a victim can be blamed for conditions that made her vulnerable, a warning about how race and class can influence the way people are perceived, and a warning about how a justice system can follow procedures while still leaving an entire community feeling that something fundamental has been missed. Pamela George's death was not mysterious in the conventional sense. There was no unknown killer waiting to be identified decades later. There was no secret confession hidden in an attic. There was no final clue waiting to be discovered. The mystery was more disturbing. It was the mystery of how a woman could be so completely known as a victim and yet still struggle to be fully seen as a human being. Her death was investigated. Her killers were convicted. Her case was studied. Her story was remembered. But the question remained. When the world looked at Pamela George, what did it actually see? A prostitute? An indigenous woman? A murder victim? A symbol? Or Pamela? A mother? A daughter? A person? A life? That question would follow her name for decades, and it would become impossible to discuss the case without confronting the uncomfortable possibility that the most important thing about Pamela had been the very thing the courtroom could never measure: her humanity. The past has a strange way of returning. Sometimes it comes through an old photograph, sometimes through a name printed in a newspaper decades after the event, sometimes through a question asked by someone who was not even alive when the crime happened, and sometimes it returns because a family refuses to let the world forget. Pamela George's name continued to surface long after the courtroom had emptied, long after the defendants had served their sentences, and long after Regina had moved on to other headlines. The case had become part of history, but history was not silent. It continued asking questions. Those questions were no longer limited to what happened on the night Pamela died. They had expanded. Why had the investigation initially gone in another direction? Why had Pamela's occupation become so central to the public narrative? Why had the final conviction been manslaughter? Why had the sentence been so short? And what did the case reveal about the treatment of Indigenous women within Canada's justice system? There was no single answer. That was precisely the problem. If the case had contained one obvious failure, perhaps society could have corrected it and moved forward. But Pamela's story contained layers: police assumptions, social prejudice, racial inequality, gender inequality, class, prostitution, the legal definition of intent, the treatment of victims, the power of courtroom language, the difference between legal responsibility and moral responsibility. Each layer revealed another, and beneath all of them was Pamela. She had become the center of an enormous public conversation without ever being able to participate in it. That fact should never be forgotten. When a person dies violently, the living often begin speaking on their behalf. Investigators reconstruct their movements. Lawyers reconstruct their decisions. Journalists reconstruct their lives. Historians reconstruct their significance. Everyone tries to tell the story, but every reconstruction is incomplete. Pamela could not tell anyone what she thought when she entered the vehicle. She could not explain what she believed would happen. She could not describe the moment when the atmosphere changed. She could not identify the precise instant when she understood she was in danger. She could not tell her children what happened. That silence was permanent. The people accused of causing her death, however, remained capable of speaking. That imbalance shaped everything that followed. The legal system had to evaluate the evidence that survived. It had to distinguish between what could be proven and what could merely be suspected. It had to determine whether the prosecution had established the necessary intent for murder. The jury eventually concluded that the appropriate conviction was manslaughter. From a legal perspective, that distinction mattered. From an emotional perspective, it created a gulf that could not be crossed. For Pamela's supporters, the question was not simply whether men had intended to kill her. They were asking why she had been subjected to such violence at all. The law could divide homicide into categories. Grief could not. The sentence created another rupture. 6.5 years. Those words were repeated in newspapers and discussions surrounding the case. The number became a symbol. To some, it represented a lawful punishment based on the conviction. To others, it represented an astonishingly small response to the destruction of a human life. A prison sentence has a beginning. A prison sentence has an end. A victim's absence does not. That difference was impossible for Pamela's family to ignore. While the defendants served their time, Pamela's children continued growing without her. There would be birthdays she would never attend, school events she would never see, conversations she would never have, future decisions she would never witness. Every year multiplied the distance between the life Pamela had and the life she should have had. And that is where the mathematics of punishment becomes inadequate. 6 years can be counted. A lifetime cannot. The public controversy surrounding the case also exposed something uncomfortable about the concept of victimhood. Society often wants victims to be perfect, innocent, respectable, predictable, easy to sympathize with. Pamela did not fit that image. Her life was complicated. She worked as a prostitute. She was indigenous. She lived within circumstances that many people knew little about. And because she did not fit the conventional image of the ideal victim, some people found it easier to ask questions about her choices than about the choices of the men who encountered her. That is a dangerous transformation. The victim becomes a subject of investigation. The offender becomes a subject of explanation. The balance shifts. The public begins asking what the victim did to place herself in danger. But danger is not consent. Vulnerability is not permission. A difficult life is not an invitation to violence. Pamela's case forced those distinctions into public consciousness. It also exposed how deeply race and gender could intersect. Pamela was not simply indigenous. She was not simply a woman. She was an indigenous woman living within a society where indigenous women had already experienced generations of discrimination. Her identity affected the way some people perceived her. Her gender affected the way her occupation was discussed. Her class affected the assumptions surrounding her lifestyle. These factors did not operate separately. They collided. And when they collided with the justice system, the result became one of the most controversial criminal cases in Saskatchewan. The case was therefore remembered not only because Pamela was murdered, but because of what happened when the justice system tried to explain her. That distinction matters. Many murder cases disappear from public memory once a conviction is secured. Pamela's did not. Why? Because the verdict did not settle the larger argument. It intensified it. People began asking whether the system had been fair to Pamela, even while it followed legal procedure. That question challenged a common assumption. People often believe that if a trial is conducted according to the rules, justice has automatically been achieved. But justice is not experienced only through rules. It is experienced through recognition. Did the victim feel recognized? Did the family feel heard? Did the community feel respected? Did the outcome reflect the seriousness of the harm? Those questions can exist alongside the legal questions. They do not replace them. But ignoring them can create a dangerous gap between legal legitimacy and public trust. Pamela's case exposed that gap, and the gap became especially wide among indigenous communities. Many people saw the case as another example of a system that had historically struggled to protect indigenous people. The anger was not created by one verdict. It came from accumulated experience. Pamela's murder became one piece of a much larger history. A history involving residential schools, displacement, poverty, racism, discrimination, and violence. Those subjects are enormous and cannot be reduced to one criminal case. But they form the background against which Pamela's death was understood. For many indigenous observers, the question was therefore not simply whether the two men had received a fair trial. It was whether Pamela had lived in a society that had ever truly protected her. That was a harder question, and it had no courtroom answer. The investigation itself became part of that discussion. The early focus on other suspects was significant because it demonstrated how assumptions could direct police attention. Investigators eventually found the correct suspects, but the delay mattered. It meant that Pamela's identity and social circumstances had influenced the initial understanding of the crime. The lesson was uncomfortable. Investigators are human. They carry assumptions. They form theories. They make mistakes. But in a homicide investigation, assumptions can cost time, and time can cost evidence. The longer a case remains unresolved, the more memories fade. Witnesses forget details. Physical evidence deteriorates. People move. Stories change. In Pamela's case, investigators eventually received information that shifted the investigation toward Comerfield and Ternowetsky. But the initial misdirection remained part of the historical record. It became an example of why investigators must challenge their first assumptions rather than become prisoners of them. The case also revealed how media coverage can influence public perception. Headlines tend to simplify. They need a victim. They need suspects. They need a shocking detail. They need a conflict. But human beings are more complicated than headlines. Pamela could be described in a single sentence. That sentence could never contain her life. The defendants could also be described in a single sentence. That sentence could never contain the complexity of the crime. Yet, once a narrative becomes established, people begin remembering the narrative rather than the evidence. This is one reason the Pamela George case remains so powerful as an object of study. It demonstrated how storytelling itself can become part of a criminal case. The public does not experience a trial directly. Most people experience it through reports, through summaries, through headlines, through commentary, through the language chosen by people who were there. And language can determine sympathy. A respectable young athlete, a street prostitute, 2 descriptions, 2 emotional reactions. Before anyone hears the evidence, the labels already create a frame. That was one of the most disturbing aspects of Pamela's story. The case forced people to confront how quickly a victim's social identity can influence the way strangers perceive her. The broader implications became even clearer as years passed. Pamela's name began appearing alongside discussions of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Her death was remembered as part of a pattern of violence that communities had been describing for years. The national conversation eventually grew much larger. Families demanded investigations. Activists demanded accountability. Researchers documented patterns. Governments faced pressure. The public became more aware. But awareness came too late for Pamela. That is another cruel feature of social change. The people whose suffering exposes a problem often do not live long enough to see the solution. Pamela never saw the conversations her death would inspire. She never saw people studying her case. She never heard activists say her name. She never knew that strangers would someday describe her as a symbol. She was simply gone. And everyone else had to decide what her absence meant. For her family, it meant grief. For the community, it meant anger. For researchers, it meant evidence. For activists, it meant a call to action. For the justice system, it became a difficult case. For history, it became a warning. But perhaps the most important meaning remained personal. Pamela was someone's mother. That fact cuts through every legal argument. A mother is not a statistic. A daughter is not a stereotype. A human being is not a profession. And a victim should never have to prove that she deserved to live. The years continued. The defendants eventually completed their sentences. The city changed. Technology changed. The country changed. The conversation changed. But Pamela remained frozen in the photograph people remembered. 28 years old. Forever. Her children became adults. That single fact contains an entire lifetime of loss. They grew up. She did not. They changed. She did not. They reached ages she would never know. She remained 28. That is the hidden cruelty of every murder. The victim's clock stops. Everyone else's keeps moving. And with every year, the gap becomes wider. A decade becomes 2. 2 decades become 3. The case becomes history. The victim remains human. That distinction is essential. History has a tendency to make tragedy feel distant. 1995 becomes a date, a newspaper clipping, an old courtroom photograph, a chapter in a book. But for Pamela's family, 1995 was not history. It was the year everything changed. It was the year before and after, and no amount of time could transform it into something ordinary. That is why the story of Pamela George continued to return. Not because there was a hidden killer waiting to be discovered. Not because the police had never solved the crime. Not because the evidence had disappeared. The case remained alive because the questions surrounding it remained alive. Questions about justice. Questions about race. Questions about gender. Questions about poverty. Questions about prostitution. Questions about who suffering society takes seriously. And above all, questions about what it means to truly see a victim. Pamela had been seen as many things, but perhaps the simplest description was the one that mattered most. She was a woman who should still have been alive. Everything else came after that. And when the world eventually remembered the case, that was a fact that remained impossible to argue with. No verdict could undo it. No sentence could balance it. No academic study could explain it away. No passing decade could make it less true. Pamela George should have gone home. She never did. And somewhere in that simple, devastating fact lies the reason her name refused to disappear.